For more than 2 centuries, the Rothschild family has held a reputation that stretches far beyond mere wealth. Their name evokes images of power, influence, and strategic mastery across Europe. Governments have risen and fallen. Wars have reshaped borders, and countless families have lost fortunes and positions overnight. Yet the Rothschilds managed to survive and thrive through it all. They did this not by luck, but through careful planning, organization, and an unusual understanding of family dynamics. From the very beginning, Mir Amzell Rothschild, the patriarch, understood that preserving wealth was not just about earning it, but about controlling its future. He created a network in which his 5 sons were strategically placed across major European cities, each with a specific role that would help expand the family's influence while maintaining strict internal cohesion. This system was more than a business model. It was a framework of survival, one that depended not only on intelligence and timing, but also on loyalty, secrecy, and control. The family treated information as a critical asset, using coded letters and personal couriers to ensure that each decision was coordinated and that the family always had the advantage over rivals. Wars, political instability, and government collapses became opportunities rather than threats because the Rothschilds had structured their empire in a way that allowed them to act before others even understood what was happening. Within this carefully constructed system, loyalty to the family was more important than national identity, and outsiders were treated with extreme caution, often kept at a distance to prevent the dilution of control. Over time, this structure became more than just a way to protect wealth. It became a philosophy, a way of life, and a set of unspoken rules that governed everything from business deals to marriages. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the social landscape of Europe was crowded with wealthy families, most of whom believed that their fortunes and positions were secure. Many were wrong. Wars, political revolutions, and financial collapses wiped out family wealth in a single generation. Inheritance disputes, mismanagement, and poor decisions often led to the rapid decline of dynasties that seemed untouchable. The Rothschilds, however, were an exception to this pattern. Unlike other families, whose fortunes vanished or stagnated, the Rothschild empire grew steadily, spreading across borders and surviving generations. The strategy was simple in principle, but highly disciplined in practice. By assigning family members to different European capitals and enforcing strict loyalty among them, the Rothschilds ensured that their collective knowledge and influence were greater than any one individual. They learned to protect their assets against external threats and internal mistakes alike. The family observed carefully the failures of other dynasties, recognizing that often it was not bad investments or poor management that caused collapse, but personal relationships and outside influence. Marriages into other families, for example, could shift loyalties, leak information, or create conflict of interest that undermined decades of careful planning. By avoiding unnecessary alliances with outsiders and keeping decision-making concentrated within the family, the Rothschilds minimized these risks. They also created a culture in which disagreements were resolved privately and mistakes were contained before they became public. This attention to detail in both personal and professional life allowed them to preserve wealth, maintain power, and avoid scandals that destroyed many other families. It was a system that depended equally on strategic thinking, strict discipline, and understanding human behavior, showing that survival required more than money. It required a controlled, deliberate approach to every aspect of family and business life. As the family's wealth grew, the importance of internal control became even more evident. Money could solve many problems, but it could not protect against all risks. One of the most significant threats, which historians have noted repeatedly, came not from governments, markets, or rivals, but from within the family itself. When marriages introduced outside influence, they could compromise control. When a family member made decisions based on emotion rather than strategy, it could weaken the system. The Rothschilds watched closely how other dynasties collapsed due to external interference and internal disagreements. They learned that family loyalty was the most reliable safeguard, while outsiders were unpredictable. Over time, this led to profound cultural shift. Marriages were no longer considered personal milestones or romantic choices. They became strategic decisions. Arranged unions within the family became increasingly common, at first subtly and then openly, to protect both wealth and influence. Cousins married each other, alliances with external families became rare, and the family tree began to fold inwards. Each generation reinforced the principle that blood relations were safer, more trustworthy, and more predictable than outside connections. This approach allowed them to concentrate wealth efficiently, reduce inheritance disputes, and maintain control across multiple countries. From a financial perspective, it worked extraordinarily well. The Rothschild became one of the few families in Europe capable of preserving vast fortunes through generations, avoiding the public scandals, feuds, and disputes that so often destroyed dynasties. Yet, while these strategies secured the family's wealth and reputation, they had unintended consequences that would only become apparent over time. By keeping the bloodline tightly closed and repeating internal marriages, certain vulnerabilities were passed down from generation to generation. These were not financial risks, but biological and psychological ones, and unlike money, they could not be managed, hidden, or controlled entirely as wealth, and marriages became more tightly controlled. Early warning signs of these vulnerabilities began to appear. Unlike public failures, these signals were subtle and often contained within private family correspondence or confidential medical notes. Certain family members were described as fragile, unstable, or easily overwhelmed. Doctors were brought in, but their reports were intentionally vague, using terms like nervous strain or temporary weakness. When these issues became more difficult to manage, family members were removed from public life and placed in private residences or secluded estates. Travel, rest, and quiet care were used to contain difficulties, preventing them from affecting public perception or the family business. Over time, these departures were no longer unusual, but expected. Silence replaced explanation, and absence replaced acknowledgement. Letters that once mentioned particular individuals simply stopped doing so, creating a pattern that historians and researchers later identified as repeated and potentially inherited. It became evident that marrying within the family had preserved wealth, but it also transmitted vulnerabilities across generations. Mental fragility, in particular, appeared repeatedly in family members despite careful management of roles, public visibility, and business responsibilities. Money and control could manage public consequences, but they could not change inheritance. This invisible pattern of vulnerability represented the Rothschilds' darkest genetic truth, a reality that could not be negotiated or planned away. As the Rothschild family continued to manage both wealth and internal relationships, the consequences of their inward-focused marriage strategy began to show in more pronounced ways. While the family's financial empire remained remarkably stable, the repeated close unions within the bloodline carried hidden costs. Scholars and historians who have examined the family's private correspondence and medical records note that certain vulnerabilities, particularly mental and emotional fragility, appeared across generations. These were not always immediately visible, and wealth often masked or mitigated their effects, but they were consistent enough to suggest inheritance rather than chance. For instance, family members who displayed nervousness, extreme sensitivity, or difficulty coping with stress were not isolated cases. Reports from private physicians and internal letters indicate that similar traits were observed in multiple branches of the family, sometimes skipping a generation and then resurfacing later. Wealth provided a buffer. These individuals could receive private care, avoid public responsibilities, and live comfortably away from scrutiny. Yet no amount of financial security could erase the patterns embedded in the family's DNA. Over time, this created a paradox. The very strategies that had ensured the Rothschilds' enduring success, the concentration of wealth, the careful selection of spouses within the family, and the strict enforcement of loyalty, also amplified inherited vulnerabilities. Each generation inherited not only fortune and influence, but also subtle weaknesses that could not be fully controlled or managed. The family's closed system was both a fortress and a constraint. The story of Liberty Rothschild illustrates the real-life consequences of these inherited vulnerabilities. Born into the structured and intensely controlled environment of the Rothschild dynasty, Liberty demonstrated intelligence, creativity, and sensitivity from an early age. Yet despite her promising abilities, she faced challenges that could not be softened by the family's typical strategies of secrecy, removal from public duties, or careful management of roles. Liberty's diagnosis of schizophrenia marked a clear turning point. Unlike earlier, more ambiguous cases described as temporary strain or exhaustion, her condition could not be hidden completely or dismissed as a passing difficulty. The family responded in a manner consistent with its long-standing approach. She was cared for, supported, and kept away from public life, but her situation could not be fully controlled or corrected through wealth, discretion, or strategic positioning. Liberty's experience revealed a harsh reality. Despite generations of careful planning, the family could not manage the biological consequences of close-kin marriages and the inheritance of mental health vulnerabilities. Her life demonstrated that money and strategy had limits, and that certain risks, particularly those encoded in biology, could not be eliminated or mitigated by any amount of planning. For the Rothschilds, who had spent centuries perfecting systems of control, this was a profound realization. It underscored that while fortune could preserve power and reputation, it could not prevent human fragility from recurring within the bloodline. The Rothschilds' response to these challenges evolved with time and knowledge. Miriam Roth, a later member of the family, approached the issue from a different perspective. Growing up witnessing Liberty's struggles and understanding the family's historical patterns, Miriam turned her attention to science and genetics. Unlike previous generations, she did not view inherited vulnerabilities as something to be hidden. Instead, she saw them as natural biological processes that could be studied and potentially understood. By pursuing a career in biology and supporting scientific research on heredity and mental illness, Miriam introduced a new approach to an age-old problem. Her decision to fund research into schizophrenia and related hereditary conditions marked a significant departure from a family's traditional emphasis on secrecy and containment. This approach not only challenged the family's previous strategies, but also reflected a growing recognition that some aspects of human health and behavior cannot be managed through social control or wealth. Miriam's work was motivated by personal experience, but also represented a broader acknowledgement that inherited traits, whether strengths or vulnerabilities, required understanding rather than suppression. By making her involvement public, she broke centuries of silence, linking the Rothschild name to scientific investigation and creating a bridge between private experience and public knowledge. This shift illustrated that while wealth can conceal many challenges, it cannot substitute for scientific insight, careful observation, and a willingness to confront difficult truths. Over the centuries, the Rothschild family story demonstrates a delicate balance between power and vulnerability. Their wealth, influence, and strategic genius allowed them to outlast empires, wars, and financial crises. Yet the very mechanisms that preserved their empire, rigid family structures, concentrated wealth, and marriages within the bloodline, also transmitted vulnerabilities that could not be ignored. Patterns of mental fragility and inherited health issues persisted quietly alongside fortune, carefully managed but never fully erased. While the family could control public perception, provide resources, and remove individuals from demanding roles, they could not change the underlying biology that repeated itself across generations. Liberty Rothschild's case made this undeniable, and Miriam Roth's scientific approach marked a turning point in the family's understanding. By observing, studying, and confronting inherited challenges openly, later generations could reconcile the need for both control and understanding, blending centuries of strategic thinking with modern scientific insight. The Rothschilds' experience illustrates a profound lesson. Even the most carefully managed empires cannot fully escape the influence of biology, and the greatest secret of any dynasty may lie not in its wealth, but in its inheritance of both power and human vulnerability. As the Rothschild family navigated generations of wealth and influence, the lessons of the past shaped their approach to both business and family life. By the mid-20th century, it had become clear that their historic strategies, meticulous financial planning, coordinated decision-making, and inward-focused marriages had preserved their fortune with remarkable efficiency. Yet these same strategies had introduced long-term challenges that could no longer be ignored. Families across Europe and elsewhere had often collapsed not because of poor management or lack of resources, but because internal vulnerabilities went unchecked. For the Rothschilds, this internal fragility manifested in subtle but persistent ways. Members of the family displayed recurring mental and emotional vulnerabilities, often described in private notes as sensitive, unstable, or overwhelmed. In earlier generations, these issues were managed through removal from public roles, private care, and discreet travel to secluded estates. Such measures worked to protect the family's public image and maintain business continuity, but they could not address the inherited traits themselves. Wealth could provide comfort, status, and privacy, but it could not change genetics. Observers, historians, and researchers looking back at family records noted a consistent pattern. When marriages occur within the family over multiple generations, the same vulnerabilities repeatedly appeared. Each inward-focused marriage, each repetition of the same bloodline, ensured that while power and control were maintained, the family also transmitted traits that were more difficult to manage. This duality, the simultaneous preservation of wealth and the transmission of fragility, became a defining feature of the Rothschild dynasty, illustrating that even extraordinary planning has limits when it comes to human biology. Liberty Rothschild's life illustrates these limits in a vivid way. Born into the structured environment of the Rothschild family, she was expected to follow the same disciplined patterns as previous generations. Early on, Liberty displayed intelligence, creativity, and sensitivity, qualities valued in the family, but she also showed signs of mental vulnerability that could not be fully managed or mitigated by wealth and structure. Her diagnosis of schizophrenia represented a clear example of inherited challenges, and it demonstrated that no amount of family planning could prevent certain biological realities. The response of the family followed long-established practices. Liberty was cared for, removed from public duties, and shielded from external scrutiny. She continued to live in comfort and stability, with access to resources and attentive support. Yet her condition could not be hidden entirely, and the fact that it appeared in a highly visible lineage made it impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Liberty's life became an undeniable confirmation of a pattern that had quietly repeated over generations. While the family could manage public perception, control information, and shield individuals from responsibility, the inheritance of mental fragility persisted. This reality presented a profound challenge to a dynasty built on prediction, planning, and control. For the Rothschilds, who had long mastered markets, political shifts, and social strategy, the limitations imposed by biology were both humbling and unsettling. It demonstrated that even the most powerful families are not immune to the patterns written into their bloodlines. The next generation responded in a very different way, combining the family's tradition of careful observation with modern scientific inquiry. Miriam Roth, who grew up observing Liberty's struggles and understanding the historical patterns of the family, chose to study genetics, biology, and inheritance. Unlike previous generations, she approached the problem openly, without attempting to hide the family's challenges. Miriam saw science as a tool to understand and address hereditary vulnerabilities, rather than as something to be concealed. She funded research into schizophrenia and other inherited mental health conditions, deliberately associating the Rothschild name with this work. This marked a dramatic shift from centuries of secrecy and careful control. Miriam's efforts reflected both personal experience and intellectual insight. She recognized that certain traits could not be managed by wealth, discretion, or social positioning alone. By investing in scientific understanding, she helped bridge the gap between centuries of strategic family management and modern knowledge of genetics. Miriam's approach allowed the family to confront inherited vulnerabilities directly rather than merely containing them. It also represented a broader lesson for anyone with concentrated wealth or influence. No amount of power can fully override biology, and the most effective response to inherited challenges is study, observation, and understanding. Through her work, Miriam turned what had once been a secret and potentially damaging reality into an opportunity for knowledge, progress, and public awareness. Looking at the Rothschild family across centuries, one can see a striking interplay between control and vulnerability. Their wealth, discipline, and coordinated planning allowed them to survive events that destroyed other dynasties, including wars, financial crises, and political upheaval. Yet the very strategies that ensured their external success, close family marriages, internal loyalty, and careful management of information, also amplified certain inherited weaknesses. Mental fragility, emotional sensitivity, and other subtle vulnerabilities appeared repeatedly across generations, quietly following the family's bloodline alongside wealth and influence. Liberty Rothschild's case highlighted the limits of secrecy and control, while Miriam Roth's scientific approach offered a way to understand and address inherited challenges. Together, these stories reveal a profound truth. While strategy, planning, and money can protect against many threats, they cannot fully control biology. Wealth can shield, educate, and comfort, but it cannot prevent inherited vulnerability. The Rothschilds' experience provides both a historical lesson and a human one. The most enduring dynasties are shaped not only by fortune and skill, but also by the natural limits of inheritance, demonstrating that even the most powerful families must eventually confront realities that lie beyond their control. The Rothschild family's approach to marriage and inheritance provides a fascinating lens into the relationship between power, strategy, and biology. For centuries, the family prioritized financial stability and control over personal choice, often guiding marriages within a family to ensure that wealth remained concentrated and alliances with outsiders were minimized. Cousins married cousins, family branches interlinked, and bloodlines became tightly contained. From a financial perspective, this strategy was highly successful. It allowed the family to preserve assets, avoid disputes, and maintain influence across multiple countries. Wealth was passed down efficiently from one generation to the next, avoiding the fragmentation that often destroyed other dynasties. Yet, the same system carried consequences that could not be mitigated with money or secrecy. As the bloodline grew increasingly closed, inherited vulnerabilities, including mental fragility, emotional sensitivity, and predispositions to certain health conditions, began to appear repeatedly. Early generations managed these issues with discretion, removing family members from public roles and providing private care. But these measures, while effective in preserving reputation, did not alter the underlying biological realities. Over time, the repeated appearance of vulnerabilities became a pattern that historians, researchers, and later family members could no longer ignore. Wealth could shield a person from societal exposure, but it could not prevent inherited traits from resurfacing, revealing the delicate balance between control and human limitation that defined the Rothschild dynasty. Liberty Rothschild's life became a turning point in the family's understanding of this pattern. Unlike earlier cases, her schizophrenia was impossible to dismiss or manage solely through removal from public duties and discreet care. Liberty was intelligent, sensitive, and creative, growing up in an environment designed for high achievement and strict discipline. Yet her mental condition presented challenges that even the family's careful system could not fully address. The strategies that had preserved wealth for generations, structured living, controlled marriages, and internal loyalty, were ineffective in controlling biology. Liberty's life revealed a fundamental truth. Inherited vulnerabilities could not be managed through social strategy, secrecy, or fortune. For the Rothschilds, this was both alarming and illuminating. The system that had guaranteed financial and political dominance for over 2 centuries had limits. Biology introduced uncertainties that wealth and strategy could not predict or eliminate. Liberty's experience demonstrated that even a dynasty as meticulously managed as the Rothschilds could not escape certain consequences of a closed bloodline. It also raised questions about the broader implications of such strategies. While wealth and control could protect against external threats, the internal, inherited risks represented a vulnerability that money alone could not address. Miriam Roth's response to these challenges reflected a new era of thought within the family. Growing up witnessing Liberty's struggles and the patterns of inherited vulnerabilities, Miriam turned to science to better understand the mechanisms behind these inherited traits. She focused on genetics, biology, and mental health, seeking to study heredity rather than conceal it. Unlike previous generations, Miriam saw inheritance not as a problem to be hidden, but as a biological reality to be understood and investigated. She funded research into schizophrenia and hereditary mental illness, openly associating the Rothschild name with these studies, a significant departure from the family's historic emphasis on secrecy. Miriam's approach illustrated the potential of scientific understanding to address challenges that wealth and discretion could not. By examining how mental health conditions ran in families, she offered insight into a reality that had long been managed quietly behind closed doors. Her work demonstrated that inherited vulnerabilities were not moral failures or personal weaknesses, but biological traits that could be studied, understood, and potentially mitigated through knowledge. Miriam's decision to confront these issues openly represented a turning point in the family's history, combining centuries of strategic thinking with modern scientific insight. It highlighted a fundamental truth. While wealth and planning can shield individuals from external consequences, they cannot prevent inherited traits from occurring, and understanding these traits requires study and observation rather than concealment. The Rothschild family's experience also provided a broader lesson about the intersection of wealth, power, and human biology. Across generations, they demonstrated extraordinary skill in preserving fortune. controlling information and maintaining influence. Yet their internal focus and repeated close-kin marriages introduced a pattern of inherited vulnerabilities that could not be controlled by strategy alone. Mental fragility, emotional sensitivity, and other predispositions appeared repeatedly, quietly shaping the family alongside their wealth and power. Liberty Rothschild's life demonstrated that even the most carefully managed dynasties have limits, and Miriam Roth's scientific approach illustrated that confronting inherited realities openly can provide understanding and insight that secrecy cannot. The Rothschild story serves as a reminder that human biology operates according to its own rules, independent of social control, planning, or wealth. Even the most successful families must recognize that certain outcomes are beyond their management. Their history teaches us that while strategic thinking, wealth, and discipline can preserve influence and protect reputation, they cannot eliminate the effects of inheritance. Ultimately, the Rothschild dynasty shows both the power and the limits of human planning. Extraordinary success can coexist with hidden vulnerability, and the most carefully managed systems must contend with realities that no strategy can fully control. As the 20th century progressed, the Rothschild family began to integrate lessons from both history and science into their approach to family life and wealth management. By observing the consequences of inward-focused marriages over centuries, they recognized that while such unions had preserved financial and political power, they also increased the likelihood of inherited vulnerabilities. Liberty Rothschild's struggles had demonstrated this clearly, showing that even wealth, discretion, and careful planning could not entirely prevent the recurrence of mental health challenges. By contrast, Miriam Roth's scientific focus represented a new strategy. Rather than conceal these inherited traits, she sought to understand them and use that understanding to inform family planning and public contributions. Her funding of research into schizophrenia and hereditary mental conditions marked a fundamental shift from secrecy to study. Through her work, the Rothschild began to engage with the broader scientific community, recognizing that understanding genetics and inheritance offered the potential to mitigate some of the risks that had accumulated over generations. This approach did not erase the challenges, but it represented a more proactive response than previous generations had attempted. Instead of relying solely on private care, removal from public duties, or the quiet management of roles, the family increasingly considered education, scientific insight, and strategic observation as tools to address inherited vulnerability. In doing so, they created a model in which wealth and knowledge could work together to safeguard both family members and the legacy of the dynasty. The impact of this shift extended beyond individual cases like Liberty's. Over time, family members began to view inheritance not only in terms of money and influence, but also in terms of health, genetics, and responsibility. Patterns of mental fragility, once hidden or minimized, were increasingly understood as part of the biological landscape of the family. This understanding encouraged a new approach to marriage and family planning. While historical practices had emphasized inward-focused unions to preserve wealth, later generations could use knowledge of genetics to make more informed decisions about whom to marry, when to have children, and how to manage inherited vulnerabilities. By combining centuries of observation with modern scientific understanding, the Rothschilds demonstrated a remarkable capacity to adapt.